You're listening to the Men's Dating Mastery Podcast with host Alec Chase, bringing you the experts in dating, sex, and relationships.
Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of MDM. I am really excited about this one. I've been looking forward to sharing this episode with you for a really long time. In this interview, I'm speaking with my personal friend, Caelin White. Caelin is a PhD resident in clinical psychology, and he's a very well-rounded guy with an impressive resume who happens to also practice what he preaches, but I will let him give you the rundown himself. In this episode, we take an evolutionary perspective based on a PhD level paper that Caelin wrote. We talk about a concept known as conditional mating strategies, which essentially addresses how human mating behavior varies with context. We explore things like arguments for and against monogamy, the value of exhibiting novelty-seeking behavior, what role physical attractiveness really plays, because there are all sorts of theories out there on that one. We talk about mate poaching, jealousy, and several other topics. In essence, we're getting into the science of mating behavior, so this conversation is a little bit more academic in nature, and it's a real treat for those of you with more intellectual curiosity. But as always, I strive to relate everything we talk about to the real world so that you can actually apply these insights to your own lives. And of course, as in every episode, we wrap up with a piece of advice that you can actually take away with you and use in your own lives. If you like this episode, then please subscribe, leave a 5-star rating and a positive review on iTunes or in whatever your favorite podcast directory is. Without further ado, here's Caelin. Hey Caelin, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Alec.
Hey, let's dive right in. But before we do, can you tell myself and the audience a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Sure. So I'm actually a PhD resident in clinical psychology, which I guess means that I'm right at the last step in my training before I guess I become a doctor in behavioral medicine. So I guess a lot of people don't really know what clinical psychologists do. So I don't know if you want me to clarify that or shed some light on
that. Sure, that'd be great.
Okay. Yeah, so basically clinical psychologists conduct scientific research on mental disorders, and they also assess, diagnose, and treat them. So, we do things beyond that as well, but that's kind of it at a glimpse. There's also a lot of confusion, I guess, between what psychiatrists do and what the clinical psychologists do. I mean, both treat mental disorders, but they take a bit of a different approach, and there's different philosophies to doing that. So, where psychiatrists are physicians that are trained, I guess, in psychopharmacology, they use medication to treat mental disorders. Clinical psychologists take a different approach. So they're kind of specialists in human behavior, both in the scientific research and clinical practice. And basically what we do is we approach treatment of mental disorders by helping people learn different ways of thinking and behaving to get different outcomes. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. And I guess personally, I'm a bit of an odd duck in psychology because I do a lot of different things outside of that. So in addition to doing, complex assessments and treatments, I also I apply my clinical training to work with athletes, performers, those that work in corporate settings to kind of enhance performance output. And I'm also an athlete myself, so I try to apply a lot of the principles that I preach. I try to apply that to my own life and better understand how these things can be applied in the field. And I guess as it's more relevant to our conversation today, I conduct research in areas that are related to human mating. So I study this area using, I guess, a number of different theories, but the most central theories that I use that are driving my research stem from theoretical evolutionary biology. So basically, I use the principles of evolution to understand why, I guess, we as humans engage in mating and relationships the way that we do.
Oh, that's great stuff. A lot of that is incredibly relevant to what we're going to be talking about and what our audience is looking forward to knowing. I was reading your paper, and a striking concept that I came across in it is this idea of conditional mating strategies and tactics. And we're going to explore some of these specific examples throughout our conversation. But before we do that, can you provide just a very high-level explanation of what conditional mating means?
Sure. Yeah. There's a ton of stuff involved in this, and so I'll try to basically boil down the complexities to something that's kind of understandable. So the concept of conditional mating strategies is basically the idea that there's no real perfect or ideal reproductive strategy that works in all environmental contexts and situations, but rather research and theory kind of shows that the best strategy for use in mating is really dependent on a number of factors that relate to the environment and within the individual. So, there's a lot of these variables that are all interacting all the time. So this stuff can get pretty complex pretty quick. But just, to try to simplify it a bit, there's a theory called RK selection theory. And basically that states the following idea. In environmental contexts where resources are poor, where conditions are unstable and unpredictable, organisms will tend to develop mating strategies that are more oriented towards less invested in short-term mating scenarios, because that's the more adaptive strategy in that unstable environment. So it's kind of like that idea of live fast, die young. When there's no time to fool around and environmental conditions are harsh, you have to develop quickly. You have to sexually mature quickly. You can't be choosy about your mate. You kind of have to get that reproductive job done before your time is up. So you see these kinds of strategies in species like that don't have high control of their environment, insects, amphibians, fish, that kind of thing. These species have short, unpredictable lives, and so they've evolved the tendency to engage in short-term mating and produce high numbers of offspring. Alternatively, in environments where resources are plentiful and where conditions are stable and predictable, organisms tend to develop, a tendency towards high invested, longer-term mating scenarios. So you see this in species that have high control of their environments and that are higher up on the food chain. So mammals, like ourselves, have evolved this tendency towards more long-term mating strategies and have relatively fewer offspring because the chances of losing those offspring to predation, like predators and environmental shifts, is unlikely. So, the important thing is that this theory not only explains differences in mating strategies between species, but it also helps to explain individual differences within the species. So this basically means that, as a result of evolution and the environment, shaping, how different species mate, it also alters how different individuals within a species mate. So what that means within the human species, basically that differences in stability, predictability, and security in the developmental environment will also shift a person, like any given individual, up or down this what's called the RK spectrum, which is a spectrum that reflects tendencies towards long and short-term mating. So I'm not sure if that was too high level or not, but returning to your question of conditional mating, the basic idea is that there's a number of factors in the environment that really powerfully influence a person's default approach to mating. And, while, we talk about these strategies, these really aren't these aren't strategies that people consciously choose. They're kind of implicit strategies that people develop. And it's not even necessarily required that you have complex cognitive abilities. I mean, these processes happen in fish and amphibians and all kinds of less complex organisms. So I'm not sure if that kind of answered the question in a roundabout way or not, but
no, absolutely it does. And I think the appealing aspect for me is the fact that mating is conditional, as you explained. And what has always bothered me is when it comes to, male-female interactions, people tend to talk in terms of black and whites and absolutes. And what you're pointing out is that it's really not that simple. And I'd actually like to build on that concept and explore a little bit this notion of monogamy or a lack thereof. A lot of the arguments that I've come across so far with respect to monogamy have been really polarizing. So you've got one side that argues that humans are absolutely monogamous creatures and that's the right way to live. And then there's another camp that's essentially states the opposite. The claim is that monogamy is this artificial social construct that evolved, less than 10,000 years ago. And it's really inconsistent with our nature. But based on everything you're saying, based on what I've read in your paper, I get the impression that there's a little bit more to it than that. There's actually multiple factors that lead to the practice of monogamy or lack of monogamy. And I was hoping you can comment on that a little bit and bring a little bit more clarity to it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you really hit the nail on the head there. I think oftentimes our problem as humans is that we work really hard to simplify our understanding of nature. And, sometimes that desire to make things simple really comes at a cost of seeing things as they truly are. And I think, in scientific research, we often simplify things so that we can kind of see, what it is that we're really looking at, in order to detect a nice effect. But really, these things are quite complex. And I guess my point is that, monogamy would be one of those concepts. So, there's a lot of people, you're right, that are arguing for both sides. One side is saying that humans are inherently a monogamous species, while the other side is saying that we aren't meant to mate with one partner, for our entire life. And the truth is that both or neither of these positions is entirely correct. So one thing I'll just start with is the fact that monogamy in the animal kingdom, which includes humans, is incredibly rare. So most animals, in some form or another, engage in non-monogamy, whether that's having multiple partners at once or what we call serial monogamy, which is committing to one partner at one point in time and then, moving on to another partner at a later time. So, and that includes females too. That's not just a male thing. We tend to see this behavior in humans as well. So relating this back to, I guess, the previous question about conditional mating strategies, individuals that develop within and are raised in a stable, resource plentiful environment tend to be more inclined towards long-term committed relationships. And that tends to involve monogamous behavior. But that doesn't mean that humans are inherently monogamous. Monogamy can and does happen within humans, but it takes special environmental conditions for that to happen. So really relating monogamy back to the idea of conditional mating strategies, there's this idea that, under certain conditions, monogamy may arise and it may be adaptive. But there's a lot of other conditions where non-monogamy is kind of a more adaptive strategy. And we see this throughout the animal kingdom, and that includes humans.
So, if we were to relate that to present day life, are there any factors that we might encounter in today's world that might lead people to choose one over the other?
Yeah, there's a lot of factors. In fact, going beyond the evolutionary, there's always evolutionary explanations for these kinds of things, but there's even more, there's even non-evolutionary explanations for this. But one of the factors is if there's a high access to a lot of high quality mates. So if there's a lot of high quality mates around, people are, and this includes females, are less likely to commit to a certain partner. So monogamy tends to be lower. There tends to be higher rates of cheating, infidelity, that kind of thing. When there's a lot of mates around. But yeah, there's a lot of other factors too. It is kind of a complex issue, but like I said, basically the stability of the environment, these are really the main drivers of, how a person falls in that spectrum of engaging in monogamous versus non-monogamous behavior and the circumstances under which they would use different types of strategies.
So you mentioned that both men and women might actually, prefer monogamy or non-monogamy, but are there any specific gender differences between the two and how both sexes approach these types of relationships? And are males prone to one type of relationship arrangement versus what women are naturally prone to?
Yeah, good question. I think the scientist in me has to qualify the answer I'm about to give by saying, that there's a lot of overlap between genders. So, we do see these tendencies, these differences, gender differences in how each approaches mating, but there's also a lot of shared characteristics. So there's a lot of males that engage in what some people might consider to be female type behaviors and vice versa. So, I think I just have to kind of preface my answer with that first. But absolutely, this is, there are these gender differences in how each gender approaches mating. And really this is involved, or this is basically rooted in the fact that there are biological differences in each gender in terms of their investment in mating. So females tend to invest much more biologically in the process of reproduction. When during reproduction, women have to, carry the child, they have to, it develops in them, and that takes a long period of time. It takes a lot of resources. And so over the process, over time, through the process of evolution, females have evolved a tendency to be more selective when they choose a mate. And they have a greater tendency towards securing, a committed mate. And that's basically required because, the resources that they require, are much greater because they're much more invested in the biological process of reproduction. Males, on the other hand, they invest less in the process of reproduction. So basically the tendency or the strategies that males have evolved in general is this tendency to be less selective when choosing a mate and more competitive for mating opportunities. So basically males are more competitive for opportunities to mate with women, and women are more selective in who they choose. I think it also requires noting that in developed countries, both genders, so in countries like Canada and, in North America in general, both genders have, and this is more situational factors that tweak this, both genders tend towards more committed relationships, although males tend to be less so. But that's not the same thing as saying that humans are monogamous. We know based on the empirical data, and most of your listeners would probably know from just simple observation that there's a lot of circumstances where both men and women in relationships, they cheat on their partners. And we know a lot about, like scientifically, we know a lot about why each gender does this and under what circumstances they do that. So, so in general, in stable environments, men and women, they both tend to be more inclined towards highly committed relationships, but the gender difference is that, males tend to be less so. And there are very specific biological evolutionary explanations for why that would be.
Right. So for any ladies that might be listening, this might be more ammunition to them if they want to go out and call us guys dogs. I mean, this is evidence to that.
Yeah, and I'm not sure I would totally agree with that. I mean, that's the reason why I kind of qualified my answer, because the truth is that monogamy and the ability to commit is very adaptive for both genders in a lot of environmental circumstances, and so and both genders have the capacity to commit to monogamous relationships. It just takes certain conditions to do that. And so, yeah, there are these gender differences that, like I said, there's high overlap, and women engage in non-monogamous behavior as well. It's just, it plays out differently.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. I think that's important for everyone to understand. Before moving on to the next topic, there's just one lingering question I had on, again, this notion of monogamy versus non-monogamy. And reading your paper, I got the sense that there might be, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there might be a trade-off between, being in a exclusive relationship that's loving and trusting versus having multiple sexual partners, but doing that at the expense of, love and intimacy. Is that true? Was my interpretation correct, or am I missing something?
No, yeah, these are some loaded questions you're dropping. These are good. Yeah, so absolutely, I think there are trade-offs for every mating strategy or approach to relationships. And yet, I'm certainly talking about this from an evolutionary perspective, but that's not the whole perspective. Or that's not the whole picture. So, I mean, absolutely, increasing reproductive fitness is a foundation for a lot of animal behavior, but that doesn't comprise necessarily all of what humans are. So humans are very complex creatures. So, we long to be understood. We want to belong socially. We want to contribute to the well-being of others in the community. And many of these things can be achieved. Some of these things can be achieved through a long-term committed relationship with a partner, with similar values. It's very difficult to cultivate intimacy and that vulnerability and being known by another person without commitment. So, and it's also hard for us to know another person without committing to them. So there are a lot of, significant benefits, to health, and just in being in a committed long-term relationship. But then there's the other side. So evolutionarily speaking, and that includes both men and women, we may, be influenced by an innate disposition to genetically diversify the species. So that means engaging in multiple mateships. And that has an underlying adaptive function for the species as a whole. And we also have a drive for novelty and new experiences. So that kind of works against monogamy too. So as you can see, I mean, these are just tiny examples, but you can see, how we're pulled in a lot of different directions by a lot of different factors around us all the time. Especially unseen developmental, environmental factors that I mentioned before. These things are always at play. So yeah, there are pros and cons to virtually every approach to relationships and mating. Whether you're just tallying notches on your bedpost or whether you're committing to a single partner for the rest of your life.
One of the things you just mentioned was this concept of novelty. I find that really interesting. I've come across that quite a bit. And one of the things I heard recently is that women tend to actually be more attracted to men who exhibit novelty-seeking characteristics, I suppose. So guys that are, out there trying a lot of different things. They go rock climbing and, they take interest in various intellectual pursuits. It was described as this novelty-seeking behavior that women find very attractive in a man. I don't know if you've ever come across that notion, but it just something that popped into my mind as you said that.
Yeah, I have, and that makes a lot of sense to me because when you think about that type of behavior, that behavior is often correlated with some very adaptive types of, like, gender-specific adaptive behaviors, like ambition, that drive to, and sometimes aggressiveness in some situations where that is called for. I mean, some of these traits are adaptive for males to have in terms of that competitiveness. And so, yeah, I mean, absolutely, those types of behaviors would be correlated, and maybe that might signal to would signal to the opposite sex that, this person has some key characteristics here that might be really adaptive.
Right. So actually on that topic of, what is and isn't attractive, it's generally accepted that women don't place the same emphasis on physical attractiveness as the guys do. Can you explain why this is the case, as well as, identify, some specific scenarios where it might actually not hold true and where women actually may place more emphasis on looks?
Yeah, this is, again, pretty complicated without kind of, understanding a lot of the underlying theories. Males on average do tend to place a high value in the trait of attractiveness more than females. But I should really mention here that both genders actually do place a high degree of value on physical attractiveness. And it's actually quite shocking. The research really does show that there's this disparity between what people will publicly acknowledge as being important to them in a partner, and then what people privately choose in a partner. So, for some reason, people tend not to, I'm not sure if it has to do with social acceptability or what it might have to do with, but people tend not to publicly admit just how much physical attractiveness matters. But when it comes to choosing a mate, it's quite clear that it's quite high up on the list, and that's true for both genders. In terms of the gender differences, there's biological basis for why males value physical attractiveness in women more than women value it in men. And that really has to do with, the fact that physical attractiveness is a correlate of, for women, is correlated with reproductive potential. So women that are younger, that are more physically attractive, that tends to signal, on average, underlying biological traits that indicate that they have higher reproductive potential. And that's something that males value. And that has to do, again, with the lower investment thing. On the contrary, women are more selective of men, and physical attractiveness isn't as important because what they're really looking for, and this, again, there are a lot of differences in terms of individual preferences for women, but on average, women tend to prefer men that are ambitious, that have access to resources, right? Because that's a very adaptive thing that they would seek out. And so women tend to place less value on physical attractiveness and then more value on things like ambition and access to resources, earning potential, that kind of thing. Because it's really about seeking a male that has those resources that are necessary for raising offspring.
Your answer came as a bit of a surprise to me, and I think you said why. There are things that we're willing to admit publicly, and research might indicate something to the contrary. And I'd actually like to explore that a little bit with you. And what I'm getting at is this research indicating that women actually do place a fair amount of emphasis on looks. I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about what we know about that, because that really is very different from what we're generally led to believe, particularly in this whole area of, helping men improve their dating skills. Usually the marketing will go something along the lines of, it doesn't matter how you look. It doesn't matter, if you're short, tall, or whatever, you can get any woman you want. You just have to cultivate those skills. And it sounds like, maybe that's, somewhat misleading marketing. I'd like to explore that with you.
Yeah, I wouldn't say outright that it's misleading. There's a lot, and I'll, maybe we could talk a bit about this, shortly, but there's a lot to be said about other traits other than attractiveness. It really does not just boil down to attractiveness, but just to, I think, address the question in terms of like situations where women might place more value in physical attractiveness. That really relates to, I think, the individual woman herself, and because there are a lot of situational factors during development that would cause an individual to place more emphasis on looks versus on certain traits. And I guess what I'm getting at here is that people that tend more towards short-term mating place more value in looks, and people that are more inclined towards long-term mating will place more emphasis on other factors, because a lot of other factors other than physical attractiveness tend to correlate with monogamy and commitment, right? Whereas physical attractiveness is generally thought to signal biological fitness, right? And like underlying, I guess, strength of your immune system, that kind of thing. So there's some really interesting research in an area called the what's beautiful is good, around the what's beautiful is good hypothesis. And that's that we have a lot of assumptions actually about the traits that we think good looking people have. So when we deem a person to be attractive, we have all kinds of assumptions about that they're socially skilled, that they're more intelligent. There's also very real world data showing that people that are more attractive, they make more money, they have greater opportunities for employment, they receive lower criminal sentences. So there's this huge bias towards attractive people in terms of thinking that they have a lot of traits, that are not associated with attractiveness, and it's a really interesting area. But like I said, in terms of when women might place more emphasis on physical attractiveness in men, there's an association between that and women that are more inclined towards a short-term mating strategy, right? Where women that are looking for a fling, for example, and men that are looking for a fling, they're going to place more emphasis on physical attractiveness because in that particular scenario, genetic material is all you're going to get out of that interaction. And so genetic material tends to be like high quality genetic material tends to be more correlated with physical attractiveness.
Right. And I think that's very consistent with what we generally see in life. I mean, if we look at, college students and, people that hook up with each other, it's really just about, if it's a woman, it's really just about, hooking up with the most attractive guy. Whereas as they get older, they get progressively more selective and start paying attention to other things. At least that's been my observation.
Yeah. And these are all, like I said, we're all just talking about underlying tendencies, but in terms of the evolutionary drivers, but there are a ton of other drivers that are equally, if not more important when we talk about things that influence behavior, like culture, a history of learning, very unique individual learning experiences. These things all tweak, the strategies that people use. And so, I'm very much talking about this in kind of general tendency terms, but, there's a lot of other things here that, we don't have time to talk about, but that really do influence quite seriously. And significantly do influence the types of mating behaviors that people engage in.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's, speaking in generality is probably the best we can do. Yeah. It's just because there is so much complexity and so many factors at play. I want to jump into another concept here, and this is the idea of mate poaching. What is mate poaching, and why would either men or women want to engage in it?
Yeah. So mate poaching, it's pretty much what it sounds like. So it's basically a person that takes another person's partner and makes them their own. So this isn't the same as cheating, although cheating might lead to poaching. It's basically when you take somebody else's partner and now they're your partner. So I guess there are gender differences. Like women might attempt to steal another woman's partner because like that male has demonstrated that he's able to commit, or at least temporarily, which might be a good fit for a woman that perceives poaching as acceptable behavior. And conversely, males might wish to poach, like they might try to poach another man's partner because that female has, for example, higher reproductive potential relative to, say, the single women that are available, right? So if you're in a small town and there's not a lot of single females, or the single females aren't of high quality, then, it might make sense to poach another man's partner, right? If you think that that person has a higher potential for, being a better partner. So these are just examples, but, the important caution that I put out there around mate poaching is if a person's thinking about taking another person's partner, you should probably know what you're getting into when you do that, because in addition to kind of like, I think, pissing the other person off, you're also not necessarily helping your situation by picking the person that thinks it's okay to be poached, right? So recent research has shown that, individuals who were successfully mate poached, they tended to be more socially passive, not particularly nice to others, careless and irresponsible, and narcissistic. So they tend to desire and engage in sexual behavior outside the confines of committed relationships. So the gist of that is that just when you think you've kind of succeeded in stealing someone else's girlfriend, you remember what you've just invited into your life. I mean, people that think it's okay to be poached and people that poach other people's partners, these tend to be people that keep their ear to the ground, right? Waiting for the next best thing to come along.
Yeah, I'm very happy I actually provided that additional comment, because I certainly don't want to condone the behavior. And, to build on this idea, you mentioned that women might want to engage in mate poaching if they find an attractive potential partner that's essentially been proven by garnering attention of other women.
So are you saying that, if a guy has a beautiful girlfriend, that he's more likely to be desirable by other women?
What I was trying to say is that women might find a guy attractive that other women have expressed interest in. When I say that, I'm trying to draw a parallel essentially between females wanting to engage in mate poaching as a way of getting access to quote unquote proven mate.
Right.
So somebody that's been essentially pre-selected by another woman, and that might indicate, well, yeah, this is a worthy partner because if another woman has expressed an interest in him, there's got to be something about it.
Yeah, there's something to that, and I think that really works both ways for males and females. I think when you have members of the same sex expressing interest in a potential partner, right? I mean, that basically shows that there's something about this person that is desirable, and I think people do tend to feed off of those things. So there's this idea of what's called social exchange theory, which is this general idea that when people are choosing their mates, they do an assessment, and a lot of this happens unconsciously. They kind of do an assessment of their own bargaining chips, right? Like, what can I bring to the table? What do I have to offer? And when you're in the process of choosing a partner, you kind of assess what your bargaining chips are worth and what you think that you might be able to get in terms of a partner. And what you tend to see is because men and women are looking for different things in the opposite sex. I mean, on average, women tend to look for men who are quite ambitious and with access to resources, and men tend to look for women that are a little bit younger that are physically attractive. What you often see is you see this kind of pairing up of males that have greater access to resources, are more ambitious, greater earning potential. You see them pairing off with women that are younger and more physically attractive because those are the bargaining chips, right, that each gender has to offer, and you tend to see people with higher amounts of those trading them off with people with higher amounts of their bargaining chips in the other gender. So basically how this relates to your original question is that I guess if you see a male that's attracting a lot of attention from other women will pick up on that, right? And they'll kind of think, okay, this guy has a lot to offer. There's clearly something here in terms of what he's being able to offer in terms of his bargaining chips. And so, that would certainly make him, I think on average, that would tend to make him, a target for potentially being poached.
I was dating somebody, and this girl had a group of guy friends. And what these guys would do, they'd go out to the bar and they'd bring her along. And they'd walk up to a bar. They might find a group of women that they want to go and have a conversation with. They'd go up to them and they'd ask their friend, let's call her Sally, just for the purpose of this example. They'd say, Sally, just come and stand nearby. And they'd go and they'd speak to these women, and then kind of partway through the interaction, they'd turn around, pretend to see their friend for the first time, and go, hey, Sally, didn't see you there, and kind of bring her into the conversation. And as soon as they did that, the interaction just would go up to the next level. So that what might be a lukewarm response from these women that they've been trying to engage would suddenly turn into a display of interest.
Interesting.
And this is something they would do consistently. And mind you, that in and of itself wasn't enough to attract them, but momentarily it changed that dynamic.
Yeah.
In the guy's favor.
Well, yeah. And don't get me wrong. When I said that, males tend to be competitive, more competitive than females, that does not in any way mean that females aren't competitive as well, right? Females are both selective and competitive, and males are too, in certain situations where, they can afford to be both. And certainly, as I mentioned, North America, generally North America is the kind of environmental context where both genders tend to be quite selective and both competitive because they can afford to be.
All right. So I'd like to jump into what's going to be kind of our last topic, and that's this concept of jealousy. Can you describe the function of jealousy and the different ways it might manifest itself in men versus women?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think, and this is probably going to have intuitive appeal, and it's going to make sense to your listeners that, jealousy obviously has a function in terms of keeping us vigilant and aware of, our partner's behavior. There is, certainly an adaptive element to it because it does help us pay attention to our partner's needs and that type of thing. So jealousy certainly does have an adaptive function. With respect to how it plays out in each gender, this is rooted in how this evolved in time, these gender differences, is really rooted in a concept that's called paternal certainty. So paternal certainty basically just refers to the degree of certainty that a man can have in knowing that a child is genetically his own. So when a man's in a relationship with a woman, and they have a child, there's no guarantee that that child is his. For example, the woman could have, could have had sex with another man. It could be his child. So the risk to a man in this scenario is basically investing resources in a child that's not genetically his own. And so males have evolved over time. Males have evolved a tendency to be jealous, specifically around sexual infidelity with women. So in other words, they're really highly vigilant for any sort of infidelity that might lead to, sexual infidelity. The thought of, I think for a lot of males, the thought of their partner sleeping with another man is like one of their worst relationship nightmares. Alternatively, women, they approach it a little bit differently. If a woman has a baby, she knows it's hers, right? There's absolute maternal certainty. And so the problem for a lot of women, the evolutionary problem, has been ensuring that their male partner is continuing to invest resources and into their relationship and the child. So the problem is really about ensuring that the male is emotionally committed to the relationship, because emotional commitment tends to be correlated with resource investment. So this is why women on average tend to be more vigilant around emotional infidelity and emotional cheating. They're kind of more jealous that way. When there's examples of a male potentially being more emotionally invested in another woman. So the main difference is that men tend to be more jealous around like sexual infidelity or the potential for that, and women tend to be more jealous around emotional infidelity. Just this again is that a lot of this stuff is rooted in these biological differences that have evolved over, hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah, that's something I've actually been observing quite a bit over the last few years. And it actually started with a comment a female friend of mine said to me years ago. And she essentially said that a woman will actually tolerate a guy sleeping with other women as long as, he consistently makes her feel good and he's attentive and she feels like when they're together, they're really together and he's there for her. And, I'm not condoning this behavior.
Neither am I.
and she actually said this to me with a great deal of reservation. She said, you know what, this is, I'm reluctant in telling you this, but this, she says, this is how I feel and this is how a lot of my girlfriends feel. And then I think she proceeded to quote Spider-Man and say, with great power comes great responsibility. So don't go and abuse this knowledge. But,
and just to tag, like to kind of piggyback on that. I mean, again, I have to say there's a very big difference between talking about what is in nature, like talking about things scientifically and what are basically tendencies, and making normative claims about what's okay and like what's, the right thing to do, like morally, ethically, that kind of thing. They're very different. So, a lot of this stuff, and I really do, again, have to qualify because this is just something I do. I have to qualify all the stuff that I've said and just saying, these are basic tendencies in nature. But that in no way does that kind of imply that this is the right thing to do or it's, the best thing to do. So.
Yeah, thank you for doing that. Two of the things that I'm really trying to do with this podcast is, I want to give guys, real tools that they use to go out and improve their dating lives, but I also want to stimulate them intellectually, which is why I like to get into some of these conversations. But I certainly always stress that guys act with the highest degree of integrity in anything they do. So when we're discussing these, this is not, these aren't tools that, men should be using to go out and manipulate women, but rather, just something to build their understanding and also just to stimulate them on an intellectual level.
That sounds great. Yeah, I agree.
Well, Caelin, this has been a great conversation. We ran a little bit over time, so I really want to thank you for sticking around and getting through all this with me. I just want to ask you one final question to wrap up. And,
sure.
Kind of in the context of this conversation, if you were able to offer, kind of one specific tangible piece of advice that guys could use to improve their dating lives, what would it be?
Yeah, good question. I should probably preface this by saying, I'm 36 years old and I'm single, so you might want to take my dating advice with a beach of salt. But, honestly, the thing that really comes through, and I think this is a really nice point to finish on, the thing that really comes through in the literature is that when it comes to what people want, and this applies to both females and males, the trait of kindness is huge, and people really value kindness. So I guess in terms of improving your dating lives, I would say be kind to your partners, be kind to others. And this is just I think it's just a good way to live anyway. But the thing that seems to top out on all the mate preference scales is the quality of kindness. And so I would just say, just work on being kind in general, and that's going to go a long way in terms of helping your dating life.
Oh, that's fantastic. I'm really pleased that you mentioned that, because I think if there's anything lacking out of this whole space of providing men with dating advice, is nobody really ever talks about that, and that's something I firmly believe in myself. So thank you for bringing it up.
Well, my pleasure.
Well, it was a great conversation, and thank you for coming on today.
Thanks, Alec.
Well, guys, I hope you enjoyed that interview. This was one of my very first recordings and remains one of my favorites. I just wanted to add my 2 cents pertaining to Caelin's advice with respect to cultivating kindness, because I really don't want guys to misinterpret it and dismiss it as some kind of nice guy syndrome that is going to keep them from getting laid. Nice guy syndrome that some guys may be thinking of in this case is essentially people-pleasing behavior that some men exhibit in order to get something in return, and in so doing show a lack of backbone. Being kind, as Caelin puts it, is about having a genuine concern for others and exhibiting kindness towards them without seeking something in return and without compromising your own values or integrity. This is not just my opinion or Caelin's opinion. There are plenty of studies and real-life observations that prove this to be so. If you enjoyed what Caelin had to say, he does have a blog. You can check it out at mindyourmentalhealthcampaign.wordpress.com. And if you want to get a hold of Caelin, his personal email is caelinwhite.cbt@gmail.com. Both of those links will be in the show notes, so you can find them there. On a separate note, I would love to get some feedback from you guys. So if the overall subject of the show interests you, let me know what you think so far. Tell me what you like, what you don't like, what you would like to see me cover in the future. You can email me directly at alec@mensdatingmastery.com. That's Alec with a C. Nothing is going to make me happier than getting an email from you guys and hearing your thoughts. If you're enjoying the show, then please subscribe, leave a 5-star rating along with a positive review in iTunes or in whatever your favorite podcast directory is. That will go a long way to keeping the show going and help me attract the best guests so that I can continue to bring you value. You can also check out mensdatingmastery.com, where you will find all the episodes to this podcast, my blog, social media links, and where you can subscribe to the newsletter to keep abreast of the latest content from MDM. I don't spam, but I will occasionally send you some great new content that you would not want to miss. Thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you in the next one.
Thank you for listening to Men's Dating Mastery, a podcast dedicated to improving the lives of men and the women around them.